we've got a good crowd. I'm going to send the sign-in list again around. If Francis doesn't have your email, if we don't have your email, would you put it down and we can send you announcements of the meetings and such. Just a few minutes before Julie gets started, I've got a couple things to go over. Number one, this year we've been doing every other month programs. So appreciate Julie coming and doing our program today. In the month of September, we will have a board meeting, which is when we do our business and talk about things. And everybody is certainly welcome to our board meeting. That's where we send out emails, kind of let people know where it is and when it is. But we'll probably be on September the 11th, which is a Friday morning. We will try to meet somewhere for coffee and have a board meeting. And then in October, we will have a program meeting again. And great idea came to me yesterday. I was driving through West Town and there was a yard sale at J.L. Tucker building. And I wandered through that building and I saw how much history is in this building. And I bought a few things to take home. And I talked to the young man who is redoing it and asked him if he'd be interested in maybe us meeting there and just doing the history of that whole Tucker family, because that is fascinating that at one time they had the supply place, which is what the Tucker building was for their tenant farmers, had the mule barn across the street, and I don't know what all else they had in their system. So I think it'd be a great program for it. And if so, we can meet over there. Might be a good way to do it. So that will be in October. Let's see, I think that's about all the announcements I've got. Anybody else have any announcements before we get on into our program? Oh, I've got a book review. That's what I wanted to do. For Father's Day, my son gave me this, The Empire of Cotton. And this is a book that's about that far over my head. It is a college level book, and it is excellent. But it goes back through the history of cotton and goes all through the British Empire when its wealth was built on cotton trade. And it was a triangle between all the cotton mills and the machinery coming into England, the slave trade bringing slaves from Africa to the Americas growing the cotton, sending it back to England, them manufacturing the cloth, selling it all over the world, and it's just fascinating. I'm going to read just one paragraph from it, which I thought was appropriate toward the back. Chances are the shirt or pants or socks that you're wearing as you read this are made out of cotton. Those pieces have found their way to you just as cotton has clothed your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, thanks to the efforts of growers, spinners, weavers, tailors, merchants, in distant parts of the globe, each inhabiting a world quite different from one another. Yet while a century ago your shirt would likely have been sewn in a shop in New York or Chicago, using fabric spun and woven in New England from bolls grown in the American South, today it's probably made of cotton grown in China, India, Uzbekistan, Senegal, spun and woven in China, Turkey, or Pakistan, then manufactured in a place like Bangladesh or Vietnam. If any part of the cotton empire whose rise this book has charted was involved in your shirt at all, that unlikely vestigial element would be a little bit of American-grown cotton. 25,000 highly capitalized cotton farmers remain in the United States, mostly in Arizona and Texas. The cotton they grow is so uncompetitive on the world market that they receive enormous federal subsidies to continue to farm it. Subsidies that in some years equal the gross domestic product of a country such as Benin. So that's just kind of the way he works through the whole thing. And any of you want to wade into it, I would really recommend it because the history in it is wonderful. Julie, we appreciate you being here today. Julie Burke, and I asked her if she would, just for introduction, if she would just give us her background, how she got to where she is, and anything else you want to tell us about it, Julie. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Well, first I'd like to thank Dr. Pinehart and Francis for calling me, and actually Francis was helping me on some stuff, and that's how we started talking about the cemeteries in the first place. But I work at the Cullman County Museum. I started my employment there in 2008. A lot of my focus has been...
Julie, I'll do a check. Otto, can you hear? Yes. Okay.
See, I told you I spoke very loudly. Originally, my focus working at the museum was about 20% museum and about 80% working with the festival. This year, my focus has changed a great bit, but in the back I've always had little projects that I work on because I'm one of those old souls. I like the history of the area. So the reason why I even was interested in the cemeteries is because I got a call about a year and a half ago, year and a half ago, about a cemetery. And I'm actually going to tell you about two specific cemeteries today. But before I get started, I'm very visual. I'm the kind of person that likes to have things to look at. So the presentation, I printed it out. There's about 25 copies, and there's places where you can do notes. So if you would like one to keep up with, you are more than welcome to have one. Now, the thing that got me interested is I received a telephone call, and it was a gentleman in town that was wanting some information about cemeteries. And the reason why he was wanting to know about the cemeteries is because there is an old German cemetery called the Spitznagel Cemetery. It's located in Township 10, Range 4, Section 14. And for those that are not on top of the townships in this area, if you get on Highway 278 and you go west, you're going to go to a little county road. It's before you get to Spring Hill. You're going to turn left, and it's down by Mr. Bradford's property. Now, the reason why this was brought to my attention is because Mr. Bradford was very upset because somebody was desecrating the cemetery there. It's an old family cemetery. He was aware of it, and they just needed information. What do we do? So I did a little bit of research and said, yes, it's a Class C felony. Go, fill out a warrant, talk to the DA, and they did that. Now, at this particular cemetery, I was curious because working at the museum, and I didn't know who the Spitznagels were, so I did a little bit of research and found out that Antoine and Mary Catherine came into the area around the 1880s. Antoine actually homesteaded the property in this area around, I believe it was December of 1884, which would have been a couple of months after she passed away. But this, you can see, is the tombstone of Mary Catherine, and this is at the grave site. So keep in mind the grave site was desecrated. So there was evidence that there was a grave there. This photograph is just another view of that tombstone. So you can see that even though this cemetery had been surveyed, it's listed on Find a Grave, and it's in Robin Sterling's books. I'm not sure about Anne Graygraff's books, the volumes that she helped produce, but it was documented. It was out there. It was easy for me to find. Another distinguished element about this cemetery is, even in Robin Sterling's books, who were published in 2006, notes that the cemetery is located at the sweet gum or the black gum tree, at the power pole, at the description that it gives. So it was, if somebody had done some research, they could have verified that that cemetery was there. Now, the person desecrated the cemetery, cut down the tree, took the stones, threw them off the side of the little ravine, and unfortunately dug sewer lines. And today, if you go to that property, or at least by Google standards today, this is an aerial view of the property. This right here is the power pole. The tree's missing, and this is a house trailer, which is why they had to dig up the cemetery, was to put a septic system in. Now, the gentleman was arrested, and they went to court. The court case had been suspended, rescheduled. In May of this year, the gentleman who was the property owner and authorized the destruction of that cemetery, his case was dismissed. I don't know why. but all he had to pay was $578 for what he did. So that's one of the reasons why I even looked up the Spitznagel Cemetery, was to find out about the family history just a little bit and to see how easy it was to locate the cemetery. Now, the place that I went originally was the Alabama Historical Commission, and this is an edited view of their homepage, and this is their website. You should have that on the in the diagram that I gave you. Now, I called the director, and she gave me some insight as to what to tell the Bradfords, who was the original people who were complaining about it. But I'll do a little bit more. I talked to her, and she said that, believe it or not, it's really, really hard to get cemeteries registered on the National Register. And so the state of Alabama created the cemetery program. And the cemetery register is the official list for the state of Alabama of historic cemeteries. And anything that is submitted and approved as a historic cemetery, all of that documentation is kept on file there. So it's there for people to review and research, especially, you know, if you're doing genealogy, it's very helpful. Now, when I originally went to the website, I was aware that, now this is the numbers for Robin Sterling's book. I counted the books 3 times. I think I come up with 193 cemeteries that he has listed. Now this is in 2006 is when his books come out. There's 4 volumes. The churches and cemetery volumes, there's actually 3 volumes. I only have 2 at the museum, but just in the 2 volumes they had listed 207 cemeteries. And if you go to Find a Grave and you pull up all the cemeteries in Cullman County, there's around 224. So imagine my surprise when I went to the homepage and went to their cemetery program for the AHC, and there was only 2 cemeteries in Cullman County listed, 2 historical cemeteries. I was a little surprised by that. When I spoke to the program director, there was actually 4. And she said 2, they just haven't updated their information, but one of them was added just recently, and that's Holly Pond Cemetery. They actually received a marker. Now, it's interesting to note, of the markers that's actually been placed, they don't even have any listed on their website. I know Holly Pond has a marker. If there's any other markers that's been placed, I'm unaware of them, and they're not on the website as being marked. Now, of those 4 cemeteries, one of them is the Baileyton Cemetery. It was the oldest grave there was Robert B. Bailey, and he passed away in 1885. And Mr. Bailey is the founder of the Baileyton United Methodist Church. That cemetery was listed at AHC in 2011. The cemetery on this side is the Hartwig Family Cemetery. The oldest grave in that cemetery is Gustav Pinehart. He passed away in 1879. That I say Mr., he was just an infant. That's the oldest cemetery at the Hartwig Cemetery, is this one right here in 1879. Now, this particular cemetery is not listed on Find a Grave, which I thought was really odd. And the reason why I thought that was odd is there's several different families that is documented in that cemetery. Let's see. I wrote it down so that I could tell you about them. The Aker family, the Gable family, the Hartwig family, the Henry family, the Pineharts. They only have 2 there, both children. The Spiegel and the Treptow, Treptau family. So you're talking about 8 families that is recognized in that cemetery. So that's why it surprised me that it wasn't on Find a Grave. Now, this family cemetery is very close to the Spitznagel family cemetery. If you go on 278 West, go past the road where you go to the Spitznagel Cemetery, you go to Spring Hill, you take a left on County Road 813, you go 5 miles down the road. This family is really well taken care of. It's fenced, and the property is actually deeded to the cemetery. It's not listed as another piece of property. So they've done a good job. Although there's not any photographs on Find a Grave for that cemetery. I did an aerial view off of Google Earth, and it's still there, and it looks like it's pretty well maintained. That's the two that's actually listed on the website for AHC today. The other two, which the program director told me about, was the Holly Pond Cemetery. It was listed sometime in the past couple of months. The oldest grave there is 1894. It's a Davis. There's over 2,000 plus interments there, and that's in Township 10, Range 1, Section 10. Then you have the Watson Family Cemetery. The Watson Family Cemetery, I don't know when it was actually listed to their register, but the oldest grave, based on the documentation that I found, was 1856, which we all know is 20-something years before John Cullman came into the area. This is in Township 11, Range 2, Section 20, and so that you'll have a good idea, if you go to Hansville, go to their post office. It's the apartment complex behind the post office. The cemetery is straight back behind the apartments. It's my understanding that that cemetery is almost completely destroyed. I don't believe that there is a marker there. Now, this is a photograph of, it's a box type cemetery plot with a top on it, and there's several different people buried in that cemetery. Mostly they're Basingers and Watsons. I talked to Kenneth Nail probably about 6 months ago about the Civil War raid, and he was aware of this cemetery, and I believe that city employees periodically go in there and clean that out, but he was not aware if anybody actually took ownership for that. But he also confirmed that it had been messed with a lot, probably a lot of school kids, college kids, that kind of stuff. Now, you may wonder why we register. Now, the cemeteries provide us with opportunities to learn about our ancestors and conduct genealogy. Cemeteries can teach us about settlement patterns, religion, and craftsmanship. It brings awareness, preservation. It establishes a historical designation, and believe it or not, there's very minimal up to no cost to have these registered on the AHC cemetery program. I really feel like if the Spitznagel Cemetery had they have been registered, I think possibly more would have been done instead of just dismissing the case. Who knows? But I would like to think that somebody would have stepped up and held that gentleman a little bit more accountable than just paying court cost. Now, another cemetery that I've done a lot of research on recently is the Dollar Cemetery. I had a lady from Texas call me wanting to do some genealogy on her family, and I was familiar with the family name because of the area that it was from. And then about 3 months later, I had a lady from Kentucky asking me about the same family. Come to find out, these two ladies were very distant relatives. But what I do at the museum is when somebody asks me something, whether I can provide them with the information or not, I always keep a little file on them. And if anything comes up, if I find out anything, you know, I'll mark it down, and when I get 2 or 3 things, I'll email them and let them know. This is what I found out about the Dollar Cemetery. This is a Google view of the Arkadelphia area. So right here is Arkadelphia, and right here is Colony. So Interstate 65 will be over here. Greenman is over here, okay? When I started researching the Dollar family, in Robin's books on Find a Grave, there is a Dollar family cemetery. Harper Hanwell Dollar homesteaded in this area in 1884. But in Robin Sterling's books, it says that this cemetery is at the base of Thunderberg Mountain. Well, let me tell you, I've looked at every map I could find everywhere, and there's no Thunderberg Mountain. But I started doing research on land grants. Now, this section right here, this square, that's section 14. The section that you don't see, which is this section, the people who homesteaded in that area was the Rice family. The Rice family homesteaded the first time in 1834, I think it's 1834, and then the rest of them, the whole section was filled up with Rice family members. So between 1838 and 1884, 85, That's all this family right here. So I looked up, and after about 30 calls, I found a Miss Stanley Rice who lives still on the family property that the Rices had homestead. And she said, well, she knew exactly where Thunderbird Mountain was. She lived there her whole life. Knew exactly where it was. It's this whole mountain range. And I was like, yay, that's wonderful. So then I started talking to more people. I've been trying to find who owns the Stanley property because I know the cemetery's there. Well, I talked to Frances. Frances talked to somebody that she knows, Miss Jackson. Miss Jackson called me. Miss Jackson went home, talked to her mom, and said, oh, I know exactly where it is. It's not Thunderbird. It's Thunderburk. Thunderburk. Well, then, that name sort of stuck in the back of my head, and I was like, Cecilia, her last name is Thunderburk. How many of them could there be in Cullman County? Well, Cecilia come by, she brought her family history, and come to find out, there were 3 Thunderburks who homesteaded in this area, and one of them was Dr. Thunderburk, one of them was Susan, and one of them was Drury. And I don't know all their relationships, but Drury is the son of Susan, and I believe Susan is the daughter of Dr. Thunderburk. Dr. Thunderburk homesteaded this area in the 1830s also. When I did a complete review of who lived in this area, and this area, almost every one of those people homesteaded in that area prior to 1840. And it was a lot of people. I was very surprised how many people, because that's sort of no man's land even today. Now, in doing all of this, I went online again and I found out who the property owners were based upon Miss Jackson's estimate of where the graveyard was. And right here, you can't see it because I didn't zoom in far enough, but right here is a house that the new property owners live in. It used to be the old church. And right behind their house, there's this little white thing. That's where she estimates the cemetery is because her mother was familiar with it. Last week, I got in touch with the property owners, and I'm waiting for them to call me back and say, oh yeah, you can come down here and look at this cemetery to see if it's even there. What's cool about this, the people that's buried in the cemetery, is the grandparents of the lady in Texas. She didn't even know that where they were buried, you know. It's not easy to find. Now, when I talked to the people on the phone, it was the Brasher couple, I explained to them what my desire was, that it may not be me physically who comes on the property. I don't get to get out much. I'm stuck in my office. But that if somebody from that area or somebody that was interested in surveying that cemetery, could they have permission to come on their property because that's where the cemetery is located? I'm waiting for them to call back. But one of the things that I wanted to assure them that if that cemetery was on the register, how does that affect the property owner? And it serves to increase the awareness of the site in hopes that it will be preserved, but it neither restricts or requires the current property owner to do anything with the cemetery. So it can be on your property. You don't have to have anything to do with it. But it doesn't even require the landowner to maintain the cemetery. But there are laws on the books, and even as recent as 2010, to help preserve that cemetery. But if nobody takes up for the cemetery, the property owner can pretty much do whatever they want to with it. That's why I think it's important to get them registered. Now, where do you begin in registering? I really thought that it would be quite difficult, but it's not. If you decide that you want to start registering it, you need to start really small. You need to organize in groups of 3 or 4. You need to have somebody in that group to be in charge of just that group. You need to have somebody in that group that can take a photograph, somebody who can write well enough to write a couple of paragraphs about the cemetery. And you need to have the fact checker. I think everybody in the group needs to be fact checkers because that's the most important thing. Photographs are very important. When I talked to the program director, she said photographs make up 80% of the documentation on whether or not it gets to be approved. You only have to be 75 years old to be considered a historic cemetery. A lot of our cemeteries qualify for that. After you organize your group, you need to choose your cemetery. And I have some suggestions on that. I'll come back to that in just a second. Then you need to set your deadlines. Then you need to gather your information, and then you need to fill out your form and submit. Now, to choose a cemetery, what I recommend is that group of 3 or 4. I like the cartoon, that's why I put it there. Look at the reasons about the cemeteries, what you want to do. Do you want to start with the ones that need to be preserved? Do you want the oldest cemetery? Do you want the ones that have the most military significance? For example, Mount Zion Cemetery, which is on Highway 31 in Vinemont. Mr. Walling and I are in the process of getting it listed. When we started looking at all of the internments, there were 4 people that fought in the Spanish-American War in that cemetery. That alone is significant enough to have the cemetery listed. I mean, just that alone. That's not even including the Civil War veterans and it doesn't even matter if they were in Iraqi freedom or Desert Storm. That's enough to have it preserved right there because those people fought for our country. The other thing is a family connection. If 4 people in your group all belong to the Nichols family cemetery, then that would be the cemetery I would pick first to preserve because it would be my family. And then, of course, the location. The further away you are from the cemetery, it's harder to get to it. So those are suggestions as to which ones that you pick. Now, going back to the registration form, I printed off about 20 registration forms, and I thought that if you would like to take one for yourself, you can. If you want to keep them and then sort of get a group and then come back and get them. If you don't have the opportunity to come back here to get them and you can't get it off of the internet, if you will call me, my name and number is at the very last page that I handed out earlier. I'll be glad to print it off for you. I'll be glad to fill it out for you on the computer so it's typed. Just going over that form, there's a couple of sections. Section 1 is the name and location of that cemetery. That stuff is already got for you. It's in the cemetery books and it's on Find a Grave. Section 2, which is probably the most daunting task of the form, is the cemetery features. But I tell you what, I filled out 70% of Mount Zion cemetery features just by looking at the data that was online. Never got out of my office. Section 3 is the historical significance. Well, just like I said, looking at all the data that I had in the books, I knew how many was in the Spanish-American conflict. I knew how many were Civil War veterans. That's enough to apply. There's so much more history there, but just that little bit is enough to apply. And all of that I had at my fingertips without even going to the cemetery. Even photographs on Find a Grave, there are a lot of people who've already been there, done the work, took photographs. This is where your fact checkers would come in. If you choose to use one of the photographs and use the information out of one of these books or off of the Find a Grave, you need somebody to go specifically to check and to make sure it's right, because unfortunately there is some misinformation on all of these sites. Section 4 is the applicant or the owner information, property tax, phone interviews, letters. The applicant is the person who fills out the paperwork. So if your group is going to be part of the historical society that fills it out, you can put the historical society and a lead person. You can have more than one applicant. Owner information of the cemetery, you can get that off of property tax records. Guess what? Every bit of that's online right now. You can pull up the property owners. One, confirm it with a phone interview and a letter. And then section 5 is just the retired attachments, which is when I spoke to the program director, they do want a hard copy of the photographs and they do want a hard copy of the application, but she said she is a computer tech person and everything, if it's sent to her in a digital format, helps her go through it faster. She said she needs the hard copy just because that's how they do things. Any kind of computer work on any of the cemeteries that you choose to do, I would love to help and be a part of that. Don't mind doing it. Don't mind typing out the paperwork for you, converting your images to a digital format by scanning them in. So it's real easy. if you just break it down. Now, if you get your cemetery registered at the historical commissions in that cemetery program, the next step is, just because you get it registered doesn't mean you get a plaque. There is another application that goes with getting a plaque. But once it is accepted, all you have to do is fill out another application. It's almost identical to the one where you get the cemetery registered. You have to raise the money to have the plaque created, and you have to order the plaque or the marker through the AHC. Now, as of their website, markers cost about $2,500. Plaques cost about $500. Now, this is a plaque that I pulled off of their website. You would have to make a stand for it, put it in a cornerstone or something like that. But it is considerably smaller than the plaque or the marker that has a foot on it. Now, Holly Pond, as I know, is the only place that has a marker right now. If somebody knows that another marker for another cemetery exists, I would like to know that, because I'd like to update my information. And when you get to this point, you just call AHC for current pricing. They have somebody that makes all of the markers. There's not a need for you to go and contact other companies to do it. They do it for you. Now, I know you got the copy of the form and of the PowerPoint. Up here on the table, they also have some other things that are interesting to have. They have a guide to cemetery care, a basic guide to preservation, cemetery laws, and the AHC register list. I printed all of those out, and they're up here. So before you leave, if you want to know about basic guide to preservation, it's here. There is also some terms. That's a really useful guide to print off when you're filling out the paperwork, because it explains to you what the different descriptions are as you're filling out your registration form. And there's also a copy of the current cemetery laws up here. And I got all of these printed out. You're more than welcome to take one for your records to help you to complete this if you choose to do that. Now, that pretty much ends everything I have to say. So, thank you for, yes?
A couple things. I've been active in the Good Hope Public Cemetery, and we recently filed for 501c13 status, which is like 501c3.
What's your name?
Don Smith.
Are you new at this cemetery, or have you been there for a while?
I've been there for about a year and a half. I've been helping my wife.
Somebody requested a list of the interments at that cemetery, and I printed them off. I have them in a form in my office. Was that? Okay, well, it's there, and the number that they gave me, I called, and either they gave me the wrong number or I wrote it down wrong, but I have a list for it.
One of the things I had to do in filing on a 501c13 is you're required by the federal government to get the tax exempt status is to address what happens to successor activities if in fact something happens and the cemetery is abandoned and goes belly up. The Alabama law is very specific, cut in the 1940s, that when a cemetery is abandoned, it is the county commission or the city then takes custody of the maintenance of it. And it's not written as an optional, that they may or they may not. So the gist of it is somebody did something in the early 40s with, I guess, what we began the rash of cemetery abandonments as roads came in and the like. But if my sense is if something occurs, you get with the county commission and say, this one over here, it doesn't say on private land or not, it just says if the cemetery is abandoned, then in fact it becomes their responsibility to maintain it.
That's interesting. Do you have a copy of that law?
I tell you what I can do is I can forward you the site by email.
That would be great.
And I'll give it to you because that was one of the things that occurred when I was going through it. There was some consternation about an individual. I've got a buddy who's a CPA who kind of helped me walk through it. But he said, I don't know if they're going to buy it or not because normally you have to go to some other charitable activity. But the substance of it is the way the law reads then the commission forms the county commission of the city forms a separate commission to handle the maintenance of that and then holds those individuals who are in charge of maintaining it harmless legally, much as if they were on the board of directors of a private firm that was recognized as a charity.
I understand. That's great. I bet you we don't follow that here.
Oh, I know we don't.
And it probably would be followed if it was brought to the attention of someone. And that's what my hope is, by us getting our cemeteries that are historical on this list, that gives us a little bit more of a leg to stand on when we go to these places and say, hey, you can't get a backhoe and do sewer lines, you know?
Also, your Spanish-American woman, we got somebody from 1812.
Fantastic.
In
I mean,
Good Hope.
that's fantastic. Why is that cemetery not listed?
Well,
I'm
to be
You
blunt,
know what I'm saying?
I went on the federal form,
Uh-huh.
and the federal's too hard
Okay.
for it to be on that registry. I mean, it was just too much
Well, I'm
given.
glad you didn't do it, because she told me point blank, just because you have an old person that's buried in your cemetery, that's not enough to get it on the National
Exactly.
Preservation
Got
Site. That's the sole reason why Alabama Historical Commission started this cemetery program.
And won't somebody buried there that's notable?
Well, it's not necessarily just notable, it has to, they're more interested in locations, historic locations, historic buildings, or an event that happened historically, not just someone who was a part of that and is buried in another place. So, and that's what the state director told me.
But Good Hope did not meet, in my estimate, did not meet the criteria to be successful in applying for the application, so I didn't fill it out.
Right.
This is entirely different.
Yes, it is, and trust me, I took the form, when I talked to Robert and told him what was going on, I was like, I mean, he has a connection to that cemetery, other than being responsible for it in a board membership, but he has a family connection to that cemetery. And I was like, wow, I'm surprised that this cemetery is not registered. And he said, I didn't know. Let's do it. So we are working, and we're basing it on his time frame because he gets out there, and some of the information in these books are wrong. Mount Zion Church, I didn't realize how much misinformation is out there, but we have it. One of the things when we were looking at the cemetery though for Robert, the property tax records has the church and the cemetery as being one and the same, and that's not the way it is. And so that was something that brought to his attention that there was a need to make sure that there was not ever going to be a problem with the cemetery because of something that might happen to the church. It was a standalone piece of property. Anybody have any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Lynch down here, this is his first meeting with us. He called because of ad.
Oh, fantastic.
But he started telling me about, do you know about this cemetery, this cemetery, and this cemetery? So he knows quite a few of them. So he either needs to tell us about them or tell you about them, or y'all get together after.
Well,
Because-
I'll tell you one other thing that I've been doing. Google Earth is a fantastic resource in documenting places. And what I've done, and I basically have done this since I started at the museum. Anytime anybody come in and told me anything about anything historically about not the city, not just the city, but the county, I'll go into Google Earth and I'll mark it. I'll have people come in and say, oh, I live over on so-and-so, and so I found Civil War stuff there. I'd go in, put a pin on it, put his name on it, put when he does it, and then I just leave it there. And it comes in really handy.
That's what I told him, that you were doing, that you were locating them on your map.
Yes, I'm locating them on my map. And one of the cool things about Google Earth is when you do this and you save it, you can save it as a file, and then you can make that file public to where anybody can go in and look at Google Earth and see where that cemetery is. You can put pictures on there, you can put links on there, you can put detailed information. One of the other projects that I'm doing along with the cemeteries is I went through and I did a digital tour for Straits Raid. Along Straits Raid, anywhere that there was a church and a cemetery, if there was a Civil War Union veteran or a Confederate internment at that cemetery, I marked the location on the map. And I thought it was really interesting because all of the ones that I did find along Straits Raid, none of them were from here. They were all from out of Georgia, the Confederate and the Union. So I haven't completed that list, so I'm hoping that I'll find somebody that actually lived here, fought here, and is buried here, but I haven't got to that point yet. I know down in the Calvert cemeteries, a lot of the Calverts were Unions. I think Sims, some of the other ones that they married into were Confederate. I had Mr. Davis come in and brief me on a good bit of history yesterday. not Mr. Davis, Mr. Wolf. And he has offered to be the legs on stuff. So there's people out there that want to do this and want to get involved and want to help with it. I think they just need somebody to step up and say, we're doing this cemetery, who wants to help with it? And I am one of those people that will say, I can help you in any kind of digital format that you want. Research on the computer. I have the books that you can come in and you can make copies on, as long as if you use their information, just acknowledge that you've used Robin Sterling's books or the books that there was a whole bunch of people that did with Anne Graygraph or Find a Grave. It's a public source. You just cite where you get your information for. But I, at the museum, can print out stuff for you. Again, anything digital, anything on a computer, I can help you do, and we'll be glad to do so. Just give me credit that I've helped you. That's all I ask.
Julia, philosophical question. When we visited over in Germany, I was led to believe that at 50 years, they disinter the skeletons, and those graves are used over and over again.
Yeah.
What do you see about the future of graves and cemeteries in our country? I look at our city cemetery and I'm wondering, how long will it last?
Well, I think that that's going to fall on organizations like the Historical Society in the areas and the museum, anybody that has an interest that can stir up enough stink, basically, about those. I'm going to go back to Mount Zion. I happen to know that they have secured another piece of property because they're getting close to being full, and it's over past Gary's small engine on the other side of the railroad track. It's on private property that they have actually given to Mount Zion Cemetery for future use. That property belonged to Roger Walling, and he said that his family didn't need it and it was there, and he just wanted to make sure that stuff was there just in case to carry on the people that needed to be buried. The city cemetery, it's the same thing. They would just have to get another piece of land. Because we have so much land, it's a very short thinking kind of way of going about it, but I think that they'll just have to secure more area. I don't see us digging up graves anytime soon.
I'd
We
never
do
heard of
that. We do that. First time I saw it was in Philadelphia, and I was in high school, and I went to this old graveyard to see Benjamin Franklin's grave, because, he's the one that's got the tombstone that says you're food for worms.
Right.
And so I'm thinking that my sister lived in Philadelphia then, and the tombstone right next to it, one tombstone, and it had like 6 names on it.
Yeah, they do that in Britain, in
What is
London
it?
too.
And
Yeah.
they do that in New York, Chicago. They don't dig up. The body has deteriorated, and this is before the days of vaults. It's generally the same family.
Yeah.
So after, I think it's 3 or 4 years, and different cities have different laws. But up there, it was after 3 or 4 years that, as the body deteriorates, they can come in. And New Orleans has that same thing too, that
Yeah.
the vaults, so it's pretty
my
common.
understanding
It's just
was-
not in the rural areas do we do that.
They lease the property, and so if like your family would own the plot, and it would be for a certain years, usually it was like 50 years, something like that, and then you would have to renew your lease. If you didn't renew your lease, if your family was dead and gone and there was nobody else to continue it, then that property would be available for another family to buy.
Correct, but they wouldn't dig up the people that were
Yeah,
left.
they just put them on top of each
That
other.
would be
Yeah.
considered desecrating a grave
Yeah.
if you did
Yeah.
that.
We've got places here in Cullman where graves were moved. I mean, everybody knows about Smith Lake. But about, where Inland Steel is, where the railroad right there? On the east side of the railroad tracks, there is at one time it used to be an 18-wheeler mechanic place. And there was graves there that were dug up and brought to the city cemetery that they found when they were doing construction to lay the concrete for the driveway. So that's within our lifetime.
Economic Memory Gardens has had something. But
Yeah.
I know two, one being Livingston Stafford Church at Crane Hill, and one being Neesmith Methodist Church at Neesmith, where people were buried, and other people came back and said, I was gonna be buried there, or my family. Both those cemeteries had people dug up, I mean, that had not been buried less than a year probably, moved in the cemetery, within the cemetery.
We have some neat things, and the biggest thing is if you do get them on the register and then they do get moved, that information is there on that register, that that cemetery did exist for people who, like the lady in Texas, can find out where her grandparents were buried.
At lunch today, I mentioned this, and my son-in-law, Wes Dawsey, is an engineer with St. John's doing the Duck River place, and he said as they were coming in the water line, bringing it in, and right east of some of the St. Bernard property, a few weeks ago, they came upon 6 indentations in the soil that looked like graves. And so they immediately called the state, who sent their archaeologist up, and they very carefully dug them all up, and they were dump sites where people had dumped trash, dug a hole and dumped trash.
Well, now, on the Spitznagel Cemetery, there was evidence of 7 graves there. Now, that's not what's written in the books. The book said that there's a marked grave, and then it is assumed that there's some unmarked graves there. And please don't repeat this as fact, but I was told that they had like ultrasound equipment or sonar equipment, and they verified that there were 7 graves at the Spitznagel Cemetery, 3 adults and 4 children. Now, the Spitznagels, that family, there are some buried at Mount Zion and 2 other cemeteries. I think the City Cemetery, Mount Zion, and 1 other cemetery. And there are descendants that are living, but it's like 4th and 5th generations that are removed or whatever. And so I think it's I think it's sad that cemetery was allowed to get in the situation that it was in, so.
Any other questions for Jim?
I want to just mention that you mentioned about over in Germany, our friends were here, and she had to rush back home because her rental was due on her parents' graves, and she had to pay that or they would dig them up. But we were over in Germany, and we went to the cemetery, and it was a dark, drizzly day, and we got into the cemetery, and they were digging up the bones from these graves where they go bury somebody else. I said, let's get out of here.
Yes, sir.
So it does happen, I saw it.
Bill?
Do you have a list of the historical cemeteries in Cullman County?
I have the listing out of the books from Robin Sterling and from Anne Gregrath. You have to look at that paperwork and you just have to find the oldest grave. Because I spoke with Robin about a year ago to ask him a little, matter of fact, I called him to find out about the Dollar Cemetery. And that was a cemetery that he didn't physically go to himself. So he couldn't give me a lot of information. It was stuff that he'd gotten out of another book. But I was telling Robin how I used his books. Of course, he wants to sell his books because that's why he's a historian, but he wanted, to get paid for the work that they did. Because he knew that my interest in the information in those books was just for research purposes, like doing this kind of stuff, he sent me a digital copy of all 4 of his books. I've since then figured out a way that I can take the information, put it in an Excel file, sort by date, so it's a little bit easier to find the oldest and to determine what soldiers were there at a different time. I've started with Mount Zion. It's time consuming, so when I don't have anything to do, I'll pull up that file and I'll organize that file a little bit more. So to say, yes, 500 of them are historical, no, I can't do that. But I can, if you say, is John Brown Cemetery over here, what's the date of this? If you give me a day, I can print you out a listing and tell you who the oldest one is, based on the information that I have.
Well, the cemetery that I was talking about is where my 3rd great granddad is buried. His wife is there. There's a Confederate soldier buried there.
What's the name of the
And
cemetery?
I think it was called Old Enon.
Okay, yeah. I've seen it. I've seen that name. There's a couple of cemeteries that are Enon, but if you call me at the museum, do you know where the cemetery is located?
Yes.
If you can tell me where the location is and the name, I'll look it up in my books. I'll look it up on Google Earth. We'll mark it, and I can tell you what's listed, what's been surveyed.
I talked to one of the older gentlemen that lived close to that, and he said when they widened that road, it's still a dirt road, the county just plowed up stones fill stones there for markers, just pile them in the pile. Is there a way that you can determine if there's caskets there? Maybe back then it was only old pine boxes and probably rotting.
Well, you just have to do the genealogy of the people that is supposedly buried there to get a really good estimate, an estimate of where they're buried and if they're buried there. There is a fee. You can go and you can hire somebody to come and do like what they did with the Spitznagel Cemetery to find evidence, because they can determine if there's a body down in there or bones. I don't know what the cost of that is, but the fact that it's something there, it's significant enough to do the genealogy on it and to do the research, and if any of it's still there, it would be important enough to get it on the register.
One other question. On a cemetery that's on private property, fenced, do you have legal rights to go into that cemetery?
Well, based on the Code of Alabama, the 1975, it says cemetery access. This 2007 law authorized certain persons the right to access the cemetery on privately owned or leased property. I have a copy. This is the current laws, and so I don't know who certain people would be. I would imagine that like what this gentleman was saying, if a committee was formed and was officially recognized, then if that cemetery was on private property, the steps, I would imagine, would be just like I've done with the steps regarding the Dollar Cemetery. I contacted the property owners who had no idea, one, they were living in an old church, and two, they had cemeteries in their backyard, which I was like, I am really sorry to be telling you this, but this is really cool. You just have no idea how cool this is. But I wanted to let them know straight up that my intention was not to try to put them in a situation where they would not be able to do what they wanted to with their own property. Again, the purpose is recognizing that it's there in hopes that the people on that private property will take some type of ownership to take care of it, or at least not to destroy it any further. And then if you have somebody that is designated that is officially designated, quite honestly, even if it's a made-up designation, I mean, I think that would give you a leg to go on. But the law says you should have access to that cemetery. It just doesn't specify who has access.
So if you knew your cemetery was on your property, would you just go to their door and say, my ancestors are on your property, can I go look?
Oh yeah, you could do that. You would try it. I don't know if the people on the property would probably have every right to look at you and say, I don't know you and I don't want you on my property. But there are legal steps that you could go, and the very first step is finding out who the property owners are, getting their permission, and just saying, hey, my granny may be buried over there, can I please go look at it? And, if they know it, I can't imagine somebody would say no. I mean, I'm sure that there are people like that would do that. But if they aren't aware, and that's what I'm hoping with the Brasher. They're a young couple. They're 36 years old. And she was a little surprised when I called her. And fortunately, she thought it was really cool that the grandparents were located. I actually think that there's another person buried there. I think it was an infant. But that's why I want to go look at the cemetery and take pictures of it to see if there was more than one stone of any kind there. So that's the first step. Finding the cemetery and calling the property owners if it's not maintained.
Julie, we appreciate you coming today. This has brought a lot of information that I didn't know.